1764, Captain Leroy Winner looked down at the map, staring at the fork in the well-worn path. He thought about what the woman in green had told him about their next target. The decision he would make here would lead the company of 160 men and women into a living hell. But before we march off into battle, switch the subscribe button sword with a foam replica. And without further delay, let's jump into the story. It was another hot day in August of 1764 as Captain Leroy Winner was conducting a check-in with his troops along the city's perimeter. With all the recent increase in hostile actions, his company, along with 3 others, had been activated and put on 24-hour operations, requiring no less than 60 of his soldiers be in position at any time. The Suko side sector was a hotspot for activity in the last few months since the military brass had begun attempting to make efforts to expand their hold within the forested region. All this though was well above Leroy's head, and honestly he could care less as long as he made it back to his bed. As he sauntered to post 6, his hand rested instinctively upon his weapon. He could have just had a communications specialist reach out to each post, but there was something about laying eyes on his troops that made his day just a little less dull. Leroy knew that walking alone to each of these posts was risky, but he had survived plenty of ambushes in the past, and the forest being pushed 1/8 of a mile back from the main wall, he'd be able to see anyone that was trying to get the jump on him. 15 minutes had passed before he crossed into the entry point of post 6, and just as he thought, nothing new had happened. Leroy got rapport and decided to monitor his troops a bit and provide moral support for authorizing some booze. He and his men were plenty happy after his 2-hour visit as he waved goodbye on his way to post 7. Stumbling alongside the wall, his head was swimming to the point that he needed to keep his hand on the wall. Taking a deep breath, he heard a woman scream off in the distance behind the tree line of the woods. Leroy saw a large shadow move in between the trees, and the woman's scream reverberated in his head. He hadn't given a second thought to the danger he was putting himself in as he ran headfirst into the heart of the Elden Forest. The most important thing to know about where Leroy was stationed alongside the borders of the Holy City of Chrysal is that the city itself sits inside the eastern half of the Elden Forest. The Suko side sector was the god of pride's, Tarma's, latest attempt to expand into the precious land. This attempt was met with constant opposition by the druids, shamans, and animals. It was so bad that at a point it was as if nature itself was fighting against even the smallest advancement in the expansion. So not only was Leroy by default surrounded by terrorists, but being out here meant any significant support was much further away. Leroy, though, wasn't the type of man to really think about his safety first when it came to his comrades being in danger, and knowing it was uncommon for druids to be attacked by animals, it was a much better chance that it was a friendly being drug off. So with crossbow in hand, he charged after the noise till he reached a small patch of an open space where he could see something that turned his stomach. The grass had been painted red with blood as 6 broken bodies lay before him. A large leshy covered in gore and viscera had a large black bear in its hand. Leroy's feet were glued to the ground as he watched the leshy smash the bear against the large stone. The bear broke against the stone like a watermelon, and his eyes grew as the bear's limp body morphed into a woman. This was unreal. Leshy were fiercely protective of nature and all of Aneru, the spirit of lightning and woods, followers. That's when he looked around at the rest of the bodies and noticed among them were dryads, nymphs, and other fae. Leroy put away the crossbow and pulled out a terralite, which is a large 3-foot-long pipe full of highly combustible explosives within a small, simple projectile. And this was their last resort since it was a single-use piece of equipment and soaked everything within a 50-foot area in flames. He didn't know what was going on, but something wasn't right, and being in the middle of posts 6 and 7, this thing could easily move on to attack his troops. The leshy reared back to smash the woman against the rock again, Leroy dropped to one knee for balance and took his best guess at which of the three versions of the Leshy was real through his drunken vision. Pushing the ignition switch, a loud boom rang through the woods, followed by a blood-curdling shriek. The projectile struck the ground to the left of the beast, but it was still enough to coat everything in fire. The Leshy ran off, catching shrubs and other foliage on fire. He knew other Fae would be here to deal with the fire soon, so he rushed around the fire to see if he could gather anything from the site where the Leshy had stood. Looking around, he didn't gain anything besides some black slugs coming out of the wood that had belonged to the creature. Leroy, taking note, was about to leave when he saw that the fire was creeping toward the druid woman the Leshy was about to kill. He knew that once a druid gets knocked out of their beast form that they're usually okay, but she was knocked out and the fire was slowly creeping toward her. He knew he should leave, but he grabbed the back of her collar and dragged her away from the site. His commander had always said that the forest was watching. Well, he had hoped that the forest would see this and return the favor one day. Leaving her safely away from the fire, Leroy returned to Post 7 and gave a debrief. After he had given the report, he was expecting something to happen, but nothing, and soon the Leshy and the Druid woman became a memory. Occasionally he'd have a dream about her or feel like he was being watched, but that really wasn't an unusual sight when you're constantly surrounded by enemies day and night. And day after day, the routine went back to normal. And then one morning, when he was called into his commander's office and given new orders, what he received made him sick. He and his company were going to be a part of Operation Snowball. The campaign was simple in theory. All they had to do was march through the Elden Forest and launch an invasion on the northern lands, home to Glace, the goddess of the winter season, and Ezeron, the spirit of earth and snow. But in reality, he knew this was a suicide mission at best. Looking at his superior, Leroy could tell he was feeling the same, but didn't want to fight a pointless argument. In the weeks following, Leroy tried to be as positive as possible, but everyone knew campaigns in the north never went well. Could they have figured out some way to breach the north, he wondered, but wondering wouldn't do him any good. He looked for every opportunity he could to get out of this, or at least increase their chance of survival, and that came 4 weeks after he got the notice. He had volunteered his campaign to be a lance, which means his team would work with the Special Operations Unit to clear out any hostile forces well in advance of the main body arriving. Some might think this was dangerous. Well, it was. But there was one thing that Leroy knew, and that was smaller units like his had the ability to retreat, reroute, or hold should they need to, whereas the main host simply had to repel or move forward. The day came where he, along with his 160 troops, had to depart the Holy City. Leroy had a rule around flexibility when it came to pushing through the forest, and that was to give yourself plenty of space opposed to the standard formation the regulations called for. So, as soon as he left sight of the city, he had put his men on a loose diamond formation which allowed the versatility to react to any druid attacks. Weeks went by without a single attack, but the scene that he had been watching grew day by day. On the 40th night, Leroy jumped awake from a nightmare as sweat poured down his face and dagger in hand looking around. At the entrance of his tent, he saw a person's silhouette clear against the campfire light. Leroy blinked and the person was gone. Nothing but an open tent flap as a reminder of their presence. He found a note beside his pillow that caused a shiver to run down his spine. Here is what the letter said.
I don't know why you saved me that day against the corrupted Leshy. Whatever you or your ilk have done to our precious guardians will be paid in blood. But I owe you a debt. In the coming days, your group will come to a fork in the path. Take a left and you all will die. Take a right and I will save you from the hunt. Speak of this to no one, or else.
Leroy's blood was pumping and knew he wasn't about to go back to sleep. So he stepped outside and saw everything was normal until he looked up and saw dozens of reflective eyes looking down, all of which were staring at him. The next several days were hell for Leroy as he debated on what he should do about this, but until he came up with a solution, he had put the camp on high alert. Day after day, he mulled over his gear, specialist, and tactics to try to figure out what he could do. And then the moment came. He stood in front of his company with a letter in hand, staring down both paths. He thought about what the woman in green had wrote, but with a deep breath, he knew what he had to do. He turned to his troops and briefed them all on what was going on. Leroy had a good life, and he wasn't about to lead his men into a trap blindly. If they were going to die, he'd die with them, and with that, they went right. As soon as he called for them to move, the trees came alive as dryads in their wooden skin phased through the trees. Squirrels rushed from bushes and shifted into wolves. Leroy pulled out his crossbow and shot a hound mid-jump, sending it tumbling to the ground as it shifted into an elf. He called for his troops on the outer ranks to use tetralights, and the mages to use fire domes and fire moles to ignite the land. Hopefully, that allowed them just enough of a distraction to make a getaway. Yet, as everyone moved to follow his orders, clouds appeared 20 feet above them and rain poured. He had caught sight of magical sigils in the treetops hundreds of feet away and wondered how many druids there were up there. With a deep breath, he turned to the sounds of roars and knew it was over. More druids in the form of bears, mooses, boars charged in all directions. At least he would die warm rather than frozen in the northern lands, is what he thought as he pulled out his sword from its sheath. The battle was quick, and before he knew it, his force had been wiped out and Leroy lay injured on his back, with a black bear on top of him snarling. He closed his eyes and waited for death, but the pressure on his chest lightened, and before him stood the druid. And before he could get a single word out, she kicked him in the face, and everything went black. Later, he woke up on the edge of the Elden Forest, hundreds of miles from home, with a satchel and a note next to him. Picking up the letter, it read,
"You saved me, and for that I owed you. Your monsters couldn't be spared, but you sacrificed your life to give them a chance. For that, I've repaid your debt and taken you to the edge of the forest. Take this and start a new life and never return. I'd hate for someone like you to waste their life. Eerie of the Fourth Outer Circle."
Leroy wept at the troops he couldn't save, but he vowed he would not waste this opportunity he had been given. 3 years later, he had published a book in Tree High where he would describe the encounter and tell the tale of the Lady in Green. We all have somebody that we'll never forget, and for Leroy, that would be the druid he had saved on a whim that had saved his life later. If you like this story, check out the Lakeside Lamia dinner case or Roffer's River water trap videos. All these stories are based on my webcomics and manga series inspired by my homebrew D&D campaigns that I ran for over a decade. You can read these for free by checking the link down below, and let me know what you think in the fan Discord where you can win free commissions from my team just by interacting.